Buenos dias, good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for our Martin Luther King Jr. Day event, a day of racial healing and service. And I want to begin by thanking our partners for making this event happen. Those partners include the Chicago Community Trust, the National Collaborative for Health Equity, Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Greater Chicago, and the United Way of Metro Chicago. My name is Jose Rico. I'll be with you this morning moderating. I serve as the Chief Partnership and Initiatives Officer at United Way of Metro Chicago, and I'm also the Director of Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation of Greater Chicago. So let me tell you a little bit about TRHT if you don't know us. We are here dedicated to confronting and eliminating the false belief that there's a racial hierarchy of human value. We believe that we need to acknowledge the shared truth that that belief has caused harm and that racism perpetuates and lifts up the resilience of people working for racial justice every day. But we work in all sectors using our methodology of racial healing to transform policies and practices in order for us to lift up our human dignity. And so events like the one that we have lined up for you this morning highlight the importance of the conversations of race, because we need to have those conversations, not only of racism, diversity, and equity, because we live in a beautifully complicated city, and we need to transform our city, our state, and our nation. Well, I know that we have a lot of work to do to achieve equity, and I am hopeful because our youth, our neighbors, and our city have fought for most vulnerable during this dual pandemic. That passion and resilience and what is needed to begin healing, repairing, and transforming our city together. We have a very meaningful program planned for you today, so please get your coffee, get comfortable. We want to hear your questions, and that our hope is that when you leave this event, that you are inspired to learn more, maybe be a little bit uncomfortable with some of the responses, but there's an opportunity to grow and for us to be part of the work to transform our city and heal our nation. For the next 30 to 45 minutes, we'll hear from two leaders who are committed to the work of racial healing and service. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please post your questions in the chat or send a private message via chat to the United Way host. After the conversation, we're gonna have a few Q&A, and after the conversation at around 9:30, we're gonna transition to our Day of Service virtual volunteer project and community conversation, which you don't wanna miss. You have an incredible speaker there, so we invite you to stay engaged and to be able to hear from one of our great United Way agency partners. And I'd like to remind you that this event is being recorded. So for those that are not able to attend, and so we encourage you to share your reflections on social media using the hashtag #LiveUnited and then also the hashtag #SolidarityHeals. We want to make sure that we capture this conversation that we're having right now, and I want to make sure that other people are knowing that you're here, that you're part of this conversation, and that we want to make sure that we're able to follow it. All right. Again, if you have any questions, put it on the chats there, and if you could please, during the conversation, mute yourself, and we're going to have an opportunity later for you to send us some questions, and I'll read the questions to get answered by our speakers. All right, so that's the preview. So really looking forward to get started. I'd like to officially introduce our speakers this morning. First one is I'm so proud to have Dr. Gail Christopher. She's the Executive Director of the National Collaborative for Health Equity, the architect of America's Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Initiative, which right now is receiving a lot of attention. She's an award-winning social change agent with expertise in social determinants of health and well-being, and has also pushed many of these public policies. And she's known for pioneering the work of infusing holistic health and diversity concepts into the public health sector. We call Dr. Gail Christopher here in Chicago, the oracle in the work that happens here with TRHT Chicago. But we know that this work came about because of her intensive research and dedication to recognizing that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, the model that we're implementing, comes from tried efforts around the world. And this model has been designed by Dr. Christopher. And we are so, so proud to have her here. So I want to welcome Dr. Christopher for this conversation. I'm really proud that you're here. And then we also have Sean Garrett, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of United Way.
It seems like maybe Jose had a, oh, now he's back.
Okay.
You're back, Jose.
Good.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, we're all good.
Reintroduce Sean.
Yeah, let me introduce Sean.
Yeah.
So Sean leads Metro Chicago. He leads the organization's regional recovery effort and place-based community development initiatives. Sean has been committed to serving others since a young age and has guided the vision of building stronger communities through his executive director role at the United Way of Central Carolina and now here at United Way of Metro Chicago. As we all know, this past year, Sean, in partnership with the Chicago Community Trust, led the creation of the Chicago Community COVID-19 Response Fund. The fund was launched at the onset of the pandemic and brought critical resources to nonprofit organizations in our neighborhoods that have been the most impacted. I consider him a friend and somebody that I could just drop by his home at any time. So Dr. Christopher and Sean, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Looking forward to the conversation. Sean, I want to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jose. And Jose is not joking when he says he'll stop by your home at any time, but it's always good to see him there. Dr. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you here. And to all of you, thanks for being with us today. It's an important day. There's a lot happening in our world right now, and we're grateful to be able to spend a few minutes with you, Dr. Christopher, learning, reflecting, and hopefully growing together. And so maybe to just start us off, could you help us with how do you define racial healing?
Well, first of all, I have to thank Jose for that far too generous introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to be part of this important day in Chicago. You know, I define racial healing by reminding us that not enough of us share Dr. King's dream. And his dream is blocked by this persistent backdrop and belief of a hierarchy of human value. Now, some people call that white privilege. I know the power of words, and so I seldom use those words. I really want people to understand that it's a lie and that it's a pure fallacy, it's a pure fiction. So racial healing is about jettisoning that fallacy, but more importantly, learning how to see ourselves in the face of the other, learning how to be honest about the harm that that persistent belief has caused, and putting ourselves to work shoulder to shoulder to create something better for our country and for our children and for our future.
That's a great place to start. So there's a lot going on in the world, and earlier you and I had talked about just the time and the moment we're in. What do we need to heal from at this current moment?
Oh, oh my God. I'm going to go to the internal level. You know, we need to heal from the demands that have been imposed upon us in terms of the exposure, the chronic exposure to the uncertainties caused by this pandemic, and the level of disconnect and disjointed response to that has heightened all of our stress. We couple that with the persistent racial inequities, and you end up with an internal dynamic that is not healthy, an internal physiological state that is not restorative, that is not balancing, that in fact makes us more vulnerable to illness. And so we have to heal from the combined twin pandemics, if you will, of persistent racism and racial inequity, and of course this this overwhelming disruption of our life that has been brought about by the pandemic, but as much by our unorganized, disconnected response to the pandemic.
So, you were very intentional and you've included truth and transformation as part of racial healing. Can you talk about why and how they are part of the overall effort of racial healing?
I will. Most of the truth and reconciliations around the world focused on bringing communities back together. Many of the critiques point out that they don't really address the history, the policy changes and the system changes. So we knew we had to design an approach for America that would heal America truly, that would make us whole. And the only way to do that is to create the structures and the systems and the policies that are necessary for fairness and equity, indeed justice. But you aren't going to make policies and sustain policies if you don't have a critical mass of people who share the vision for the healed America, for the America that lives up to its aspirational goals.
So we have a number of civic leaders joining us today, individuals from the corporate community, the government community, and the faith community. What is the responsibility of these leaders in the times like this, the times that we're in today?
It's a big responsibility. And one of the lessons we've learned is that leadership carries with it tremendous responsibility to create a narrative that reflects the truth of our collective responsibility and our shared humanity. So one of the things leaders need to do is to be about propelling forward a new narrative of who we are as a human family, who the people in Chicago and in the region are in terms of their interconnectedness and interdependence, and be brave enough to face the harmful narratives that have been previously projected. So narrative change is a key part of the framework, and certainly the local leaders should step into that and lead in terms of what they are projecting to the public. Local leaders need to be about the business of building trust and relationships across racial lines, bringing diverse people together. That's the second component of our framework, for sure. That's the healing work. And in Chicago, there are a lot of people who've been trained to help facilitate that. And then we have to be willing to address the tools, redress, if you will, the tools that sustain racial hierarchy. And they start with our segregation, our separation. They start with a legal system that's embedded in racism and racial hierarchy. And then, of course, an economy that does not project opportunities, equal opportunities, or provide equal opportunities. So that's the framework of TRHT: narrative change, racial healing and relationship building, overcoming the legacies of structural separation, oppressive legal dynamics, and of course, an unfair economy. And I think that there's a role for civic leaders and business leaders to embrace that strategy. They can do it within their own organizations, and then they can help to project that insight and that growth and that development out to the populations that they serve.
Great. So I'd like to go a little deeper actually on the business leader side. What role do you see in business leaders have in helping to shape policies and practices that can support a more inclusive society, specifically thinking about it from an economic point of view, but also from a social point of view?
Business leaders have a lot of authority. And I think, once again, we've seen what the power of authority can do. In this last few weeks, we have seen that power used and misused. So business leaders can hold others accountable, as well as themselves, to certain standards of integrity and ethics and racial justice and racial healing. They can make sure that their leadership is representative of the diversity of the communities that they serve. They can make sure that the avenues for upward mobility within the companies are reflective of the historic injustices, so that there are pipelines for success. They can also make sure that they examine how their marketing strategies either propel justice and fairness and humanity's equitable and equal dynamics, or are there marketing tools propelling images of racial hierarchy and injustice? So there are many, many ways that civic leaders can become engaged, but the first step is to believe that it's important, to believe that it's a priority. And that takes sometimes some work within the organization at the level of the board of directors and the leadership, building that sort of critical mass of will within the company, and then helping to build on that mass, that critical mass of will, to implement a strategy.
Thank you. Most of us on this call today are here in the Chicago region. We call it home. We really enjoy and love to be in this community. And yet we also know we're home to some of the largest disparities in the country, whether it be life expectancy, economic mobility, educational attainment, you name it. We have enormous disparities, enormous segregation. So what can we do here in Chicago? How do we begin to start this work? And in particular, how should THRT be part of the efforts in this region?
Well, the good news is that TRHT is part of the efforts in this region. This is, again, the framework that I talked about before. Chicago really has a lot of work to do around the narrative. Chicago has to be authentic and honest in talking about how the racial hierarchy belief system has shaped Chicago economically, socially, the violence that we experience today. You know, we can't just talk about the outcomes and the data. We have to do that within the context of the history of the community. And so I think the narrative work is really important for Chicago. You know, I spent 25 years in Chicago. So when I say that, I do say it from lived experience. And then, of course, there needs to be an acceleration of the brilliant work that's already happening, being led by Jose and the TRHT team, to just build relationships and build, I guess social capital might be a good phrase, but certainly to build trust and to realize that we're all in this together and that we all have to learn the skills of listening and perspective taking and empathy and compassion, which we've seen what the lack of that can do to a democracy. And then, of course, you know, there are challenges with development, with access to affordable living, with access to business opportunity that follow the grid of racism and racial segregation and redlining that's historic. We also really have to continue to work on the systems, both the criminal and the civic or civil legal systems that are rooted in this legacy of devaluing some people and valuing others. But there's the creativity. You know, in Chicago, we can do anything, really. And then, of course, designing an economy that is bold and creative and just, and that is held accountable, that there is real opportunity for people, particularly as we come out of the devastation of COVID-19. We've got to be as creative as they were during the coming out of the Depression. You know, we really do have to create some amazing, innovative opportunities for employment and for progress economically.
I think we all would ask you to maybe sign up for 25 more years in Chicago. That was a good start, but if we can get 25 more years, maybe we'll make even more progress. One last question, and you touched on this, but maybe if you're able to go even deeper, just what does authentic healing look like in Chicago, and what do we need to do to get there?
I love that question, Sean. Authentic healing is really about connecting across, you can't, people say, am I a racist, right? I think in America, we have to say, how racist am I? Because we have all consumed the Kool-Aid. It's the backdrop of our society. And that's true for everybody. We all don't know the different people, and we have biases and stereotypes about those people that the narratives have shaped for us. So we really do have to have the gift of being in the presence of the perceived other and being drawn into their personal stories that allow us to begin to see and connect our common humanity, and therefore to break down these barriers. We aren't going to sustain social change without a critical mass of public will to do that. And that is all wrapped up in what I mean by racial healing. So that when people say we're all in this together for COVID-19, that's also true for racism. This is a communal experience. And so the healing of it is a communal process. we have to come together, people, and we have to do it now virtually, but we do have to come together and learn to appreciate the humanity and the lived experiences of people that are different from ourselves.
That's great.
But you know, Sean, I would like to turn the tables and ask you a question or two. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, I'd like to know, when did you first become aware of racism and make a commitment to doing something about it and bringing about justice and fairness?
Yeah. I think of two distinct periods, once as a young person and then once as an adult, as kind of that stand out. So the first, as a young person, I was born, grew up in New York City, just outside the city. And then we moved to Atlanta, Georgia when I was about 10 years old. And when we moved to Atlanta, this was, early 90s timeframe, growing city, lots of things going on. And my parents wanted us to see all of the city and all of the experiences that were there. And so very early on, we went and we visited Martin Luther King Center. Just an amazing experience to be in Ebenezer Baptist Church, to hear the preachers, to hear the experience of what that was like. And I remember being, wow, it was powerful. And anyone who's been there, it's a powerful museum. It's a powerful testament to his work, but also the great inequities that existed and still exist in Atlanta. But then a few weeks later, we went to Stone Mountain. And for those who don't know what Stone Mountain is a state park in Georgia. It's either a big rock or a small mountain, depending somewhere in between. But carved into it is a monument to the Confederacy. And this is a state sanctioned park. And as a young person, I remember, we were there on a Sunday and they have a laser show on this Sunday. And if anyone's ever been to it, it literally is a reincarnation of the Civil War as told through the Confederacy. And to be 10, 11 years old as a white male and to see the reaction both of folks at the Martin Luther King Center and then the reaction at Stone Mountain. And there's a portion of it where the statues come alive, and I remember the crowd just going crazy. And just as a young person, I didn't fully understand all the things behind it and what it meant. But I remember in particular seeing, some young African-American kids around my age, and to see them actually also be excited by it. And it was just such a confusing and kind of difficult thing to put into context. But to know that there's something just was not right about it. And so that was, I think, one of the first times I really just saw, like, this is really scary. And it was difficult. I remember talking to my parents afterwards, and they tried to talk me through it and what our roles were. And my mom's a teacher, my dad's has worked in nonprofits his whole life. So they said, this is what you're supposed to do something about. This is where you go. And so that was an early age experience. And then later in life, actually, when I was in Charlotte, I had the great privilege to be part of a 2-day workshop on racism. And there were a lot of things that were really hard about that workshop. But one of the exercises they did that has stuck with me was they asked everyone in the room to say, what do you love about being white? And what do you love about being Black? And it was literally the first time I'd ever thought of that question, right? And it was obvious. It was the first time I had ever thought of it. And basically every other white person in the room, it was the first time they'd ever thought of it. And very quickly, all the white people, myself included, would say, well, do you mean like, what do I think about what it's like to be Catholic? What it's like to be a male? What it's like to be Irish? Like finding ways that we would identify, because race is not a construct that we have had to identify with. And so person after person, white person after person said, I just don't know. And you saw people struggle. And then you started getting to Black people of all ages. There were some young Black people, there were some older Black people. Instantly, our culture, our hair, our style, our charisma, our willingness to overcome, like there was no hesitation. And the point that really hit home was, in our country, you're Black every day. If you're white, you don't have that choice. You don't have to. I can be Irish. I can be Catholic. I can be a male. I can be a kid who grew up in New York, or a kid who grew up I can be any of those things, because the color of my skin is not necessarily the first thing that someone associates their judgment of me. And it just was a profound experience for me as an adult to say, if these are folks that are all at this workshop together, this isn't even the open general population. This is people who've chosen to self-identify to be at an experience of race. And yet that's the experience and the vast differences that we've had. we have to do more. We have so much more work to do. And it's really stuck with me from a professional context of we have to educate, we have to bring those experiences to life for all of us, so that when we're living our day-to-day experiences, we recognize that I have that privilege of just being white and not thinking about that, and not everyone does. And therefore, what are the differences that we have to do, and how does that impact people throughout their lives?
Wow, thank you so much, Sean, for being so open and sharing. And what you shared embodies racism. It isn't just race, right? It is racism. Right. It is the cost and the consequences of that belief, that false belief system in a hierarchy of human value. You are a man of privilege. You are a white man, and with that comes privilege. But could you tell us how, you talked about it a little bit, but could you talk a little bit about how you translate or leverage that privilege for the changes that you and your heart believe need to happen?
Yeah, so I mentioned that my parents, have grown up in kind of, I call it the social service world, and that's the prism of which they taught me. And when I was in college, my dad wrote me a letter, because my dad's weird like that he writes letters. I don't really know why, but he's gotten into texting now, so we've moved on to the next level. But in college, he wrote me a letter, and it didn't have the language of privilege, because that wasn't necessarily the language we used to communicate, but that was the theme behind it. And his point was, you've been given a lot, and you have a couple choices. You have the choice to look at what others have that you don't, and talk about that, or you have the choice to recognize the fact that you have these opportunities that others might not have had, and then what are you going to go do with them? And he throughout this letter, and I give him a hard time because I think about this letter often. He said, if you use that privilege to advance your own career, you'll have disappointed us. If you use that privilege to advance others, you will get much more in return, but you will also then have used the privilege that you're supposed to have. And again, it wasn't the word privilege that he used, but it was that concept. And it's something that's really always stuck with me, that I am a white male. I mean, the fact that you and I are having a conversation is, you've accomplished so much, and I just happen to be here, and I have that privilege, right? And so the question is now, what do I do? How do I bring others in? And I think that's a lot of what we think about at United Way is we have privilege, we have access. We set up a meeting and 100 people, 200 people will come to it. Are we using that to advance our aims, or are we using that to lift up voices of others, to help drive those voices, to help ensure that those are the voices that are making decisions? Jose talked about why play space is so important to me and us. It's not about the place, it's about the people in the place having the ownership of the place. And I think that's the opportunity that we have, and people of privilege need to, I would challenge to say, let's not argue whether we have it or not. Let's argue about what we're doing with what we've had, and how are we advancing it for other people, and leveraging that privilege in a way that allows others to come behind us. And I'm hopeful that I'm raising two young white privileged boys, right? I'm hopeful that they will have some of those similar lessons, and that they will be able to use the privilege that they do have. But I'm also hopeful that over time, maybe there'll be just a little bit less of that privilege, and that there'll be some changes that will take place.
Wow. Great questions. I'm sorry, I gotta break in a little bit because the questions on the chat are popping. So I'm gonna see if I can get to all of them. Let me get a couple real quick. One, and this is to both of you. I will start with you, Dr. Christopher. How do you think that this moment is different? This moment in time is different from each one of your point of views?
We have more awareness and more willingness in the country, indeed in the world, to actually dismantle structural racism and heal from it. If you look historically just at the numbers of people who engaged previously in the civil rights movement, they pale in comparison to what we've seen over the last summer. And then this recent horrific occurrence here in the nation's capital, it really did pull the covers off of what we as African Americans and people of color, we knew that the police departments were infiltrated with the far right wing and the white nationalists. We knew that the military was a place where this is being developed and it's being nurtured. And so, but now, you know, this is much more visible. So that's one of the things that's so different. The other thing that's so different, let's get real, most of the children in this country today are children of color. So our collective future depends on creating opportunity for most of our next generation. We don't have a choice. If we're just pragmatic and self-interested, the viability of our economy in the future depends on doing this work. Sean?
Yeah. You know, well, I'm not going to try to add to your contribution. So the one piece that I think a lot about of why it's different, and you know, I've seen this written a lot of places, is it's in front of us. It's clear for generations. And you know, Dr. Christopher, I imagine much of your upbringing, you know, the experiences of racism were things that people talked about, but weren't things that people could see, and therefore, unfortunately, it was folks like myself hearing about police brutality, hearing about these systems of inequity, and having to believe it or not believe it. Today, it's all on video. It's all in front of us constantly, and you can't unsee it. You simply can't. You know, what we saw over the summer of the murder of George Floyd, you can't unsee it, and you can't say that it was anything other than racism. And I think that has created an opportunity now where, one, people know they're not alone, because social media and other connectivity allows us to all know that we're in this together. And two, you can't unsee the things that maybe were always there, but were invisible to so many. The invisible has been made visible. And I think that's a really powerful tool for creating momentum and change.
And so now doing a question for both of you, and starting with you, Sean, what is at stake if we don't get this right? What do you think is at stake for us as a city or as a country if we don't get this right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Christopher talked about, you know, the majority of kids today are children of color. I mean, are we going to grow into a country that the majority of kids are disproportionately negatively impacted? Is that the future we want to have? And where does that take us? I think we're at a moment where we've seen terrible things occur for many years, but we have seen 2020 be a year that I think, for at least my lifetime, has been the most challenging experience. And so where do we go? Do we build, and do we build back in a stronger way? Do we take advantage of the chaos, if you will, that's all around us to put in place structures and systems that actually can help propel us forward? Or do we continue down this pathway of negative light and darkness and challenge? And I'm optimistic that we're in a moment, and because of the movement and because of leaders like Dr. Christopher and Jose, your work, and so many others, that we do have this moment where we can build back in stronger ways. And we've seen some examples, but I don't think it's a given. And I do think it's really important that right now we recognize these are intentional steps that have to be taken, and each of us have to play that role. And if we don't play that role and just assume somebody else is going to do it, 2020 becomes the inflection point in the wrong direction. And I think we have the moment, but we've got to take intentional steps to make it different.
I agree wholeheartedly with what you said, Sean. You know, America as a whole, as an idea, as a country, has benefited from so much privilege. And this country stands on the shoulders, the unpaid shoulders, the exploitation of so many. And we have deep fault lines as a country. And so whether this experiment in democracy is really going to be the shining light that we like to think it is, I think it really depends on whether we galvanize the courage to do this work. If we don't, these fault lines in our core structure as a society will be exploited by our enemies. And we have seen this already. We have seen the destructive potential of allowing fault line to be triggered into quakes that disrupt our lives. I've lived here in DC now for 25 years. It is unimaginable to see this nation's capital look like, you know, a fortress, look like we're at war. And so I think the very viability of our democratic aspirations are at risk if we don't do this work. And it's not a blame and a shame game. It's genuine work to build a fabric, to weave together the gift of the diversity of this country with a sincere understanding that all people's value and worth must be respected, that all people deserve dignity and opportunity. So I would think our democratic experiment, our experiment in democracy, is really at stake.
Great, great. So these questions are coming in. I'm going to ask a few questions. It doesn't have to be answered from both. You could build off of each other. So that way, you know, I'll take your cues. Of the next question that was asked is, can any of you share an example where a corporation or coalition of corporations or a municipality has instituted the framework and that have promoted equity?
First example, Sean, I invite you to, or Jose for that matter, but I was impressed with Buffalo, New York. Buffalo's Community Foundation has led an economic roundtable and commitment of leaders of that city with very specific goals and objectives based on the data in the city. And they have made amazing progress toward more equitable conditions. And I really encourage you to be in touch with the Foundation of Greater Buffalo. You could also be in touch with many of the other cities where this has been implemented by visiting the W.K. Kellogg Foundation website, Heal Our Communities. They have the stories of the various cities that they have funded to do this work.
So I've been very impressed with the Buffalo work as well, and Jose has brought it into conversations. I'll give you two local examples that are works in progress, but I think are at least enough to be excited about. One, there's a coalition of about 45 or 50 companies that have come together, aptly termed the Corporate Coalition, to look at what they can do from a beyond philanthropy. So philanthropy is obviously an important component of this, but beyond philanthropy in the South and West sides and in partnership with the South and West sides of our city, and looking at things everywhere, everything ranging from hiring to business location to what we're calling catalytic investment, you know, taking their balance sheet and turning it into assets that can be utilized in communities that have not been invested in. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And you know, it's still early in the process, so we're going to have to see where it takes us collectively. But I'm heartened by the number of companies who have said, and really, this started over over a year ago, and then got steam over the summer. Said we have to do something different. We know that what is happening now isn't working. And then a specific example, and I don't know if our friends from BMO are here, but there was an article actually just this weekend in Cranes that talked about some of the work that BMO is trying to do, starting at the board level, looking at its executive leadership, and then all the way down through a pipeline of hiring, and how does it diversify and lead differently. And we are very close with Dave Casper, who's their CEO, but with a number of their leaders there are they're committed to this, and they're committed to it in ways that go beyond just the words. You know, there's a lot of things that we have the privilege at United Way of working with BMO on that don't get into the press and doesn't get talked about, that we know that they are actively looking at how do they as a financial institution utilize their great assets differently, and how do they make amends. And they're very clear to say, we are a part of the issues. Mm-hmm. We have been historically a part of this. So how are we going to be different? How are we going to have more leaders of color at our important tables? How are we going to ensure that our banking work is done in such a way that is, not just making amends for redlining, but actually looks at what the future looks like? And so I've been really, really heartened by the approach and the leadership of Dave, but also, he's got just an incredible dynamic team. Many people know Eric Smith and Tracy Morris, just some really powerful leaders on that team who are trying to take a financial institution and turn it into an engine for really good throughout our community. And I think that's something that could be really powerful if done correctly.
Great. You got a lot of questions. I'm going to see if I can get two quick in before we transition. Keep them coming. I had about 3 questions that are kind of the same, which is, how can we educate those that may not be aware of racial equity and what we're trying to accomplish somebody says that's perceived as enemies, right? Because they're not really enemies, but how do we start having those conversations with people without offending them, without turning them off, and trying to have the conversation around how these conversations around racial equity are beneficial for all of us?
So I like to remind people that it really isn't a conversation. The idea of racism and its consequences are really experienced, right? And so the way to people's heart and to their emotions, and that's where we have to land with this in order to stimulate commitment. The way to people's heart really and to their emotions is through story. And that's why I'm so proud of the work you're doing there in Chicago with the racial healing circles. Because you're not going to really be able to look at these issues without defense necessarily if they're new to you, without an experience that has touched your heart in some way. And so this capacity to do that, to create these experiences that are grounded in compassion and understanding and driven by a shared vision for change. There's an art and a science to that, and you know it there in Chicago. We just have to take it to scale. There are people on, like a political pollster would say, there are extremes on either end. Our work is to expand the middle exponentially so that, again, we do build this critical mass of willingness.
I love the idea of expanding the middle, by the way. I think that's such an important part of these conversations. And Jose, I would just add, to white colleagues, I mean, I think it is incumbent upon us to not just listen and be part of these conversations, but to embrace them and in some cases help lead them. So much of this work falls on Dr. Christopher, on Jose, and that is a burden that is not fair, and it's a burden that needs to be shared, and it's one that can make us really uncomfortable. But I think if we can embrace it without the understandable defensiveness that can come from it, and instead it's a shared experience, it's a reality, and now where do we go? I think there's a lot of opportunity, and the more you engage in the conversations, it doesn't necessarily get easier, but at least you understand it a little bit differently. And what I have found is I feel worse about it oftentimes afterwards because I now understand even more of the issues and challenges. But it at least gives me at the same time some hope that if more of us can come to that middle, we have that opportunity for there to be different outcomes in the future.
Great. And real quick plug, if people are interested in joining Racial Healing Circles, we're going to be doing a series of Racial Healing Circles starting in February. You could go to transformshy.com and you'll be able to sign up for that. Here's another question that came up, and it says, Dr. Gail Christopher, you mentioned earlier that white privilege is a fallacy. What did you mean by that? Can you elaborate?
Oh, I meant white supremacy. To say it suggests that it's true. And so I always say you have to always, sort of condition it with the lie of white supremacy, the lie of white superiority. That's what I meant by that. Truthfully, as a human family, we are 99% more alike than we are different. And this construct upon which Western civilization has been built, this lie that somehow your value as a human being is less based on the amount of pigment that you have. I mean, it's just an absurd lie. And a big part of our work is to undo that lie. And until we do that, we're going to keep recreating the manifestation of that lie, that belief in our society. So that's what I meant by that.
Great. Last question, because we are going to transition to our service project. And this has come up in a couple of different iterations. Basically, recognizing that we are in a moment of pain and transformation. One of the questions is, how do we as one body, one city, and one nation, how do we become part of the healing process together? So I want to put it out there.
Well, I would say, we've been through an era, especially this summer, of calling folks out And we're moving into a time when we must call people in. We must lead with a genuine desire to be in this together. You know, we must find it in our hearts to connect with one another as human beings, recognizing that this notion of a human hierarchy of value, you know, it's been the backdrop. It's in the air we breathe, and it is our collective job, if in fact democracy is going to survive. I dare say, even if the human species is going to survive, because of the planetary crisis we are facing, we've got to learn how to value the lives of others and value the lives of ourselves and value the planet that we live on. And so this is a consciousness work. This is a shift in the way that we think and feel and relate to ourselves, to others. It really comes back to, it's going to sound a little hokey, but it really comes back to learning how to love ourselves and extend that love to others.
Great. Well, Jose, I'm going to give you three things, hopefully very concrete. The first is to spend as much time as you can around people like Dr. Christopher. Dr. Christopher, your presence, your calmness, your soothing language, just the way you talk, I have found incredibly compelling every time we've been on a call now, and just incredibly insightful. And so first of all, thank you. But I'd encourage all of us to spend as much time as we can with people like you, like Jose and others. Second, there's a lot out there that you can read and teach yourself. And I want to just give a shout out. I think my friend Johannes Williams is on the call right now. And a few weeks ago, he had sent me a link to Cast, the audiobook. I have it as well as the written version. I'm better, it turns out, on listening than I am on reading. But you know, there's a number of books that you know, I've been reading and listening to over the last 6 to 8 months, and they all help you understand the context. They understand some of the language and terms and where it's coming from. And I'd encourage you to do that at your own pace, because you know, it helps you better understand the things around. I found Cast to frankly be, for me, one of the most helpful in understanding just the incredible differences that are out there. And then finally, the last thing, and I'm really excited to share with all of you that United Ways across the state are launching today a 21-week equity challenge. This is an opportunity for you to join, you know, people all around the state on what steps we can take together. How can we learn together? Where do we go from this work? And you know, it's 20 weeks long, 21 weeks long. And the idea by doing it that way is it's just like any other habit or skill that you're trying to develop. It takes time. And we have to understand that this is a day-by-day, a step-by-step process. And doing this over 21 weeks can provide great opportunity and strength, but doing it together is something that's really, really powerful. And so though, if you're interested in signing up, I'd encourage you to go to unitedwayillinois.org/equity-challenge. The link is up here. I'm sure we can send it out, probably in the chat as well, but it's an opportunity for all of us to work together, to take small steps, but collectively those small steps can have a profound impact.
Great, great. Well, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dr. Christopher. It was an incredible conversation. I want to thank you, both of you, for joining us for this part of the program this morning. It was an incredible conversation. The chat said we had many people receive so much out of it. Thank everybody for asking those incredible questions, and hope you got answers. And we know, as part of this day, when we honor and remember the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, we want to be able to close the program, this part of the program, which a quote that is unfortunately as relevant today as it was more than 50 years ago. And this is something that he said when he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. And Dr. King said, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil when it's triumphant." And we know that a lot of times it seems, especially during the events that we've seen, is that we might be defeated and those that are wrong might have the upper hand. But we have to remember that when we have love in our hearts, and as Dr. Christopher stated, we see ourselves as one human family, that's when we know that we are in the right path. And so thank you all for being here. Again, please stick around. We have our virtual service project and community conversation that's about to come up. We have an incredible community leader that's going to be with us. So we'll start in about 2 to 3 minutes. Stick around. Thank you all.